Hey everyone, my name is Pindile Kunene, and I am an educator at Chisimani Center for Activist Education. My task tonight is quite a simple one. I will be facilitating the webinar, and I will be chatting to Ayabonga, who's joined us now. I'm sure you can see him on screen. This webinar is part of a series of 5 webinars brought to you by My Vote Counts and Chisimani Center for Activist Education. And these are really webinars about a local government system that is in crisis. And we're asking a range of questions, starting with what are the causes of the local government crisis? How did we get here? Going into what happens when municipalities fail. And tonight's question is really what happens to people's livelihoods, to people's income, to jobs when municipalities cave in and when municipalities fail and when social infrastructure, roads, water, electricity seems not to be working across many parts of the country. Our speaker tonight, as I said, is Ayabonga Cawe, who is a thinker, an activist, a development economist who's very much also into the media, content creation and development, and the author of a new book called The Economy on Your Doorstep. Aya will be talking to us about these questions, but it's just important for me to outline that this webinar, the thinking behind this webinar is to really deal with a number of questions. The first one is this growing trend that we see across many cities, across many towns, where businesses and business organizations and groupings are taking municipalities to court over electricity, over water, over failing social and economic infrastructure, and businesses increasingly citing municipal failures as the reason for disinvestment or intentions to pull out of certain parts of our country. The most famous of that case is the Clover case in Lichtenberg, where more than 300 jobs are on the line. Many have actually been lost, and workers have either been forced to join the train and relocate with the factory, the company, to KZN or take severance packages. That's the most famous case, but it's not the only case. Increasingly, we are hearing about a case in the Eastern Cape, Ayabonga's hometown, Ekomani, where Twiza, the soft drink manufacturer, is citing municipal failure, and it's saying that increasingly business is becoming difficult to conduct in this town, in this place, because the crucial inputs, water, electricity, roads, and so on, it's increasingly hard to find those things. It's increasingly becoming difficult to do business in those areas. And then we have somewhere 2.5 hours outside of Johannesburg, the town of Standerton, which has the Vaal River running through it. We've got Astral Foods, which is the manufacturer of your Goldie, your festive chickens, and so on, citing municipal failure and municipal collapse as something that is making life increasingly hard from a business perspective. And they actually took the municipality in that area to court around those issues. So we've got this growing chorus and complaints by business grouping, business organizations about municipal failure. But our task here tonight is to center ordinary people and ordinary people's experiences and ask the question, what happens to ordinary people when municipalities fail? But not only that, to also think through the instruments we can use to fix what is wrong and to fix the crisis. So that's what we will be doing tonight. And just to give us a little bit of context, before we go to Aya, we'd like to play a short clip of about 3.5 minutes, which is really about this case in Lichtenberg, where almost everything is not working. And it's a clip that really shows the story beyond Clover and talks about how the relocation of Clover is likely to affect the town and the community and all of that. So we'll play the clip And then we will hand over to Aya, who will outline the issues for us, and then we will have a discussion Q&A and see where we go with this. So Joel, I'll give it to you to play the clip. Thank you.
Pothole after pothole after pothole line the streets of Lichtenburg, and it's just one of many service delivery issues residents in this northwest town deal with on the daily. These issues were brought to light when Clover announced that it would close its factory in the area. While the mayor has hit back at the company, many fear that Clover's move could have an impact on the town's unemployment rate.
It's going to affect our business because most of the Clover employees, they are buying here food and stuff. So we only make money by them. So if they are not here, we can't make money. And that will even result to us losing the shop. Then we don't even have work, we'll sit at home again. It's very tough, né? Because if you wake up in the morning, né, there is no water. You sleep, there is no water, and you have to come to work early in the morning. That time you didn't bath. Even if you come to the work here, there's still no water. Sometimes even no electricity. Even in the locations, yeah, we are living like that. It's a normal life for us. We've even accepted. We've tried to contact them, but no answer.
We as a business are very grateful and owe our existence to the greater Ritsburg community. We don't want to move our business, but if things continue to worsen, the road infrastructure and basic services, we will have no choice but to relocate. We employ 330 permanent people. We are through various efforts, individual efforts, and also through the Chamber of Commerce, tried to engage the municipality to get to a workable solution for poor service delivery, but to no avail. The road infrastructure in the industrial area of Lichtenburg is in a very dire state, and we basically had to take over the responsibility of maintaining these roads just to get them in a drivable condition for our trucks. This is obviously costing us a lot of money on a monthly basis, which is impacting our competitiveness as we are a national fleet. On top of the efforts that we put in every day to maintain the roads by employing our own equipment, we as businesses in the industrial area, even at some stage, had a memorandum of understanding with the municipality to fix the roads ourselves by supplying the necessary materials, the skills, but also by appointing competent contractors. But we couldn't get the necessary permission from the municipality to work on the roads because they insisted on us giving them the money to do it themselves.
It's really getting worse because me myself for the last 4 days, my electricity is off. There's problems at the substation. They've been working on it for 4 days now, but my electricity was on for like an hour last night. So in the morning, early in the morning, I have to drive to someone to go shower, to get to work. I start work at 7 o'clock, so I must go and drive to my friend's house to get showered like 5 o'clock in the morning. Your food goes bad because the electricity is off. And then when the substations is not working, the water supply is also cut off.
I reside in
All right, thanks very much for that. Aya, I'm just going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Pindile.
Yeah.
Okay. Afternoon, comrades. I think it's the evening now. It's after 5. My apologies that I speak to you all in a vehicle. I think I'm already at the public broadcaster. I do a show every weekday in the evenings. And I think if I had done it in the studio, it would have been a bit too loud for us to have some reflections on what we've just seen in that video. I was just thinking as the video was playing that there are often a lot of similarities between Lichtenburg and the Twiza case that people don't often talk about. And maybe that might be a good starting point for us in the discussion that I want us to have. Is it possible for me to share my screen? There's just 2 images I want us to take a look at just as we start. Is that fine?
That's perfect.
So maybe just before I get the authority to do this and to share the images I want to share, let me just first talk to the similarities that I see between Lichtenburg and Esbeleni, and why I think they are relevant to some of the themes that I explore in my recently published book, The Economy on Your Doorstep. And I think the first one is this very close proximity to what was known as the native reserve, broadly defined, not just as the homelands, the former TBVC states, but in a broader sense of the word, the types of marginal and peripheral areas that are quite critical, I think, in any understanding of underdevelopment and development in South Africa. So let me make the example. Lichtenburg is not too far from the townships of Itsoseng and what is now known as Maikeng, and the former seat of the Bophuthatswana government, which was Mmabatho. Now, the questions around the viability of industry in places like Lichtenburg on the back of the systemic failure of our municipalities is fundamentally the replicated concerns of the Twiza that Pindile was mentioning earlier on as an industrial player. But I would argue that even the people of the broader Enoch Mgijima area, who also, just like the people of Lichtenburg, happen to be close to what used to be Esbeleni, which was in the former Transkei homeland, but which was also an industrial decentralization area in a very similar sense to what one might have found in many other industrial decentralization areas in the former Bophuthatswana. Now, I mention this because a big part of a lot of the concerns that I have when we talk about local government is not only local government insofar as the distribution of powers and functions, the budgets to be able to do some of the things that are important for the reproduction and the production of life, but it's also linked, I argue, to very critical social reproductive needs. So aside from just industrial and economic production, the role of local government is even much more important than just the provision of water and the provision of roads for the trucks of certain industrial players to be able to move. It is also critical to the social reproduction of life. So the provision of water, sanitation, the disposal of waste, the regulation of cemeteries, the provision of recreational facilities, the creation of local markets to go and sell whatever it is that we're producing at a household level, becomes a critical part of what many people might call counter-cyclical policy framework. If we are in an environment where the economy is not growing, deep investments in social reproductive enablers, like the provision of water, the provision of electricity, and many of the other things that I've mentioned, is not just solely an economic concern, but is also in many ways a social reproductive concern and a massive operative player in the political economy of any space. Think just briefly about what we saw over the last few days or so with that stadium. Now, that stadium was built with something called the Municipal Infrastructure Grant, which in the division of revenue, so the money is collected, all of the taxes are collected at a national level. They are then divided between the provinces and the two spheres of local government, depending on the authority and the functions that people would have. And I think you would undoubtedly be familiar with this. But if you look at all of the grants, even at a regional and even at a local economic level, water services infrastructure grant, regional bulk infrastructure grant, the municipal infrastructure grant I just spoken about. There's also the upgrade of informal settlements grant, which is set to start in the not so distant future. The National Electrification Programs grant, all of those grants and the scale at which those grants grow or reduce, and in the particular moment we're in now decline, has an implication on the ability to socially reproduce multiple generations of our workforce. And a big part of this is because many of the places, and I want to talk about the places that are underdeveloped outside of our metros, and we can have a reflection around, the places that are close to industrial centers. But I argue that when we speak about this issue of social reproduction, we often don't talk about it because there's a certain tension and a contradiction in capitalism between the ability to socially reproduce yourself from one generation to the next and the logic of economic production. And one of the contradictions of that is in the externalization of the obligations of care. Now some people might say, well, how do you move from industrial concerns to concerns of care that are solely within the ambit of the home in many instances? Well, we can't run away from it, because economic production in the capitalist sense is not possible without social reproduction, without the birthing of, the next waves of the workforce, the next generation of the workforce, without caring for the young, without caring for the old and the ill, without all of these effective tasks, capitalism would not be able to function nor reproduce itself. And I think in the South African context, with the history that we come from, it would not have been able to have as at the center of its logic this idea of very cheap energy and cheap labor, which was so critical to the accumulation path of capitalism in South Africa. Now, I mention these two things because if we're interested in really dealing with the deepening dysfunction, not just in the example of Lichtenberg that we saw, but I would go to another example, not so far from Kwakwa, in a place like Harrismith. We have to accept the contradiction that in South Africa, capitalism has developed under conditions where its reason for existence was the underdevelopment of the places in its margins. And what we're seeing now is a change in placemaking that has happened in the democratic era, especially in the margins that were in what I call the native reserve. And I'm interested in how those former TBVC states have remained the same, but I'm also interested in how they've changed, because in many ways that frames the possibilities of our inquiry into how does this dysfunction play itself out in the economies of people and in the homes that they find themselves in. So I want to maybe talk just briefly as I wrap up about what has changed. I think the reality of life in the rural areas and even on the urban periphery is that there are many drivers of what has changed. The first is climate variability and the implications that this has had on household production in the countryside, in places like the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape, the Northwest, and in KZN. And I think the second one is then, of course, the role of social grants and social transfers as a facilitator of household level consumption in a context of the decimation of the productivity and even the working age population of many of the rural areas. Because many of these places are places of very old people and very, very young people. The third element is, of course, social grants with the deindustrialization of the South African economy have replaced wages and remittances from the urban core as the main income source at a household level for many homes in what I call the native reserve, due to massive job losses that have come from the mining sector, agriculture, and from the manufacturing sector. But the other thing that has really changed, which I think is critical to the next set of remarks I want to make, is what is called the limited social control measures. So during apartheid effectively limited, from a racialized and a gendered perspective, who could move to what place, who could live where, and who had rights and claim of citizenship. And some of the implications, of course, of being alien in particular spaces. You have to carry a pass, you have to have a lodger's permit and all of these things. And we don't have that anymore. And I think, we might think that that's an archaic thing, but if you go to a place like China, many people have argued that the hukou system, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly, is a similar type of system to what you had, which was about regulating the flow of people from the countryside into the urban centers. And I'm not calling for some form of regulating the population flow, but I'm suggesting that it is much freer and much easier to leave Tsofimvaba today and go and settle in Cape Town than it might have been maybe 50 years ago. And there's an implication to that, because it then means how we plan for the urban must always be conversant with some of the migration and the cost and what I would call, the push and pull factors that drive migration into many of the cities that we have, and that create the space for many of the contestations that we have in our urban core. And a lot of this has to do with the underdevelopment of our countryside. Now, what has remained the same? There are many problematic things that have remained the same. One of these is what I call ethno-linguistic provincial boundary making. There's a big debate happening at the moment in the Western Cape around this issue of federalism. And it's an old debate. I mean, if you go back to the early 90s, It was a big debate, even in the negotiation fora, this idea of a unitary state vis-a-vis a federal state. And it wasn't necessarily the divisions drawn across racial lines, because you might have had on the one end maybe the ANC and others more left of the ANC, say the PAC, with a more unitary conception of what the new South Africa is going to look like. And on the other hand, you might have had an IFP, which might have had a bit more by way of federal designs. And a big part of this is re-emerging in very, very particular ways in the Western Cape, which is trying to contest this notion that we are in a unitary state and there must be the free movement of goods and people across our different provincial boundaries. And in many ways, it's a corollary of a broader issue that is happening at a continental and even at a global level around boundary making and using that as a mechanism to determine access to economic resources and the distributional questions around who belongs and who doesn't, and who must be built for and who must not be built for. I think the second thing is also that many of the migration corridors that there were have remained unchanged. That corridor from the former Transkei and the former Ciskei to Cape Town, the corridor from the former Leboa, Kazankulu, and Bophuthatswana to certain parts of the west of the what is now the Gauteng city region, and there would be many others. I mean, the migration from Lesotho to the parts of the Free State, all of these remain the same. And I think what we're starting to see is the reproduction over successive generations in multiple, very differing gendered implications. So a Basotho migrant of the 70s and the 60s and the 50s might have been a male mine worker. A Basotho migrant of now is a female domestic worker. And a big part of this has to do with how households remain a shock absorber of market failures, and I would say societal failures in the care chain. And when we talk about the care chain, it's really about this idea of, many who have means and who have jobs are able to really take those tasks and in many ways, pass those effective tasks on to low-waged workers in the ambit of their homes. And those low-waged workers pass the effective and care tasks of their own children to other more precarious, and more low-waged, family members, relatives, people in the communities that they come from. And in many ways, this constitutes what, somebody like Nancy Fraser calls the global care chain. And the massive cross-border, and when I say border, I also mean provincial boundaries, massive cross-border implications of some of those societal failures in the provisioning of care. And then I think the fourth one is that many of the places that are former homelands still remain places that are faced with massive constraints to any economic value adding productive activity. So I'm not talking about creating malls, I'm not talking about consumptive types of investments, but value adding investments in the production of things, adding value to those things. And in the book, I make mention, for instance, of the distribution of the dairy value chain in a place like the Eastern Cape, still very much concentrated in the former republic. And even with the geographic advantages that there might be, still very much unembedded in the former homeland areas of that particular province. And then I think the last one is that wages in the main and in general, and this is borne out in many surveys, be it by the national statistical agencies and others, wages remain much, much lower in the former TBVC states than in other parts of the urban core. And I think a big part of this has to do with how we've thought about the design of space. And maybe just a last comment is that I think there are really, 5 areas where there's going to be contestations and struggles that many of us are going to have to be part of around our cooperative governance framework over the next while. The first is in the distributive flow. So from national to province to local of the resources that are a critical site of contestation in many of these areas. I think the second one is what I've mentioned around demarcation and boundary making. And thinking about this issue of federalism alongside, for instance, what we've seen as the Matatiele, Khutsong, Bekasdal, Vuani questions around provincial boundary making. The third one, I think, is there's this massive threat of municipal dysfunction to economic production. And in many ways, I argue that all of the industrialists now are in many ways also part of the service delivery protests, which is something that might not have been thought of before, but the reality is that municipal dysfunction is no longer affecting the ambit of the indigent home, but is affecting all manner of economic actors at a local level. The fourth one is that we're going to see a lot more contests and fights around resource allocation for disaster and social risk events. We saw it with COVID-19. We've seen it with the drought. We're going to see it with floods. We're going to continue to see that. And increasingly, I argue we're going to see it with the deindustrialization that's happened and the scarring of the economy by COVID-19 in critical challenges around hunger. And I think that's why we need to mount an effective social response to that. And then I think the last one, coming back to the stadium that we saw, there is massive possibility, and it's already happening in South Africa, there's violent spillovers, what I call intra-class conflicts in the political economy of tenders, of outsourcing, of preferential procurement, and of course, where the political administrative interface serves as a mechanism for this political economy and accumulation projects to happen. We're going to continue to see the violent spillover of this, into, in many ways, I think the processes and procedures of election, succession, and contestation, not only inside the governing party, but even within the spheres of government at a local level. Thank you very much, comrades. I will pause there, and I look forward to some of the questions and the comments and some of the interactions.
All right, thanks very much, Aya. There's already a question in the chat box. But in a sense, so you've given us a historical picture, a picture of underdevelopment, and you've linked, or you've, I suppose, urged us to think beyond the crisis as just the local government crisis, and spoken about history and structure linked very much to colonialism and apartheid. And then concluding off with some of the issues that are likely to cause fights in South African society today between different social actors and even within the working class itself. I'm going to read this question for now, but I'm just wondering, when you sort of come back, if you could just expand on this point around municipal dysfunction and how the people who are affected now, the layers in society who are affected now, go beyond working class people, and how business is responding, and if there are some dangers and things to look out for there. But the one question we've got in the chat box now is on the issue of ease of movement. How should we look at urban development in the future in light of the increasing unpredictability of population flows? I'm having in mind the management of the conditional grants as a case in point. And that's Mandisi asking that question. There was another question which I'm struggling to locate, but maybe we can take that for now.
Yeah, no, thanks, Comrade Pindi. Look, I think, let me maybe marry these two questions, because I think there's also the question from Zolani in the chat. And that question is around, whether or not a big part of the dysfunction is around lack of integrated thinking and planning. Now I think that is one explanation among many others. I do think the lack of coordination and harmonized planning and execution on critical things is a major pain point. But I think even if you create something, and I mean, this is the debate that's happening at the moment around the district development model, is that even if you create and you place in the performance plans of people and you make sure that you've got the mechanisms and the processes in place to make sure that people work together, you still are going to be confronted by the political economy questions in what I call this political administrative interface. So let me give you an example of what I mean. You've got IGR forums at a municipal level, and many people's experience of those who work as officials is to say, look, either people are sending too junior officials to make decisions that have any binding, implication on any tier of government, or people aren't attending at all. Then there's the second question around supply chain management, where effectively we have ceased to be a capable state, but we become in many ways a clearinghouse for specifications around tenders. So you look at the juniorization of particular functions in organograms at a municipal level, because that is a reflection, in my view, of one, the distributional issues around how the resources are going to go, which technical directorates get not only just the financial capacity, but even the human resources, the political clout, and the ability to move on particular projects. And I think for me, unless we deal with those organizational, institutional, and I would argue political questions, then we're going to be chasing our tails on this thing. I mean, the example Mandis is making around urbanization is to say, look, in South Africa, we've seen massive urbanization even within rural provinces. So you've had massive flows of people in the Eastern Cape, for instance, and even in the Northwest, from the rural areas to the industrial core of that province, which shouldn't surprise us. But I'm still unclear about what our national spatial framework, let alone our cooperative governance framework, says on this particular issue, and what are our instruments to try and, I hear people are saying reverse urbanization. I don't think that's something that you want to do, because it's highly unlikely that you're going to achieve anything. But the idea is that you have to make sure that people have alternatives in the countryside to make urbanization an option that they opt into, and that they have at least scope and a basis to opt out of. Because if you don't do that, then any shock that happens in your urban core is going to be replicated in very severe ways in the countryside. And we're already starting to see this. I think on the conditional grants, I'm always shocked how, for instance, with electricity, when we talk about neighborhoods that don't have electricity, the debate is always framed in rural terms. So in terms of saying, yeah, let's get transmission lines in to sparsely populated areas. But I seldom hear the debate of how do you connect in situ many of the temporary that have become permanent settlements in our informal settlements. I don't hear of an INEP, the Integrated National Electrification Grant, going in any meaningful way into the upgrade in situ of informal settlements and reconnecting those informal settlements in very different ways than the traditional, I guess, fossil fuel driven, but also traditional transmission mechanisms that we have. Those debates are not happening. And I think, if they are happening, they're certainly not happening in places that are accessible to many people in the public. And I think this is where organizations in the political space, in civil society, have to be able to grapple with this, but also have to build programmatic solutions to contest that space. Just like we have to contest the just transition and the direction and the contours of that transition, or else it's going to be determined by climate financiers and many other people.
All right, thanks very much for that, Aya. There's another question, or rather a comment in the chat box. We have seen an acceleration in local government corruption. Is it that there is purely political class that lives on local government corruption? How would economic development happen in a den of thieves? Quoting, in a sense, some of the terms that you use in the book to talk about corruption at public sector level, at corporate level, and so on. And that question comes from Zama. Do you want to respond to that question now?
Yes. Just briefly, Comrade Pindile. Look, I think Comrade Zama's question is important because, in the book, I try and use this theory of reservation wages. Now, it's a neoclassical theory, but I always say it has some value because it counterposes this issue of economic choices in the context of abundant versus limited alternatives. So a reservation wage is that wage beneath which you are not going to wake up in the morning because you feel like it's not worth your time. And that decision is only made on the basis of your assessment of what other alternatives are open to you. Now, you might be asking, how does this answer Zama's question? Well, the severity of the corruption that we see in many places in the peri-urban and in the rural context at a local government level, outside of the metros, outside of the massive industrialized districts, has a lot to do with the severity of the political contests. So we are willing to kill one another for a particular role that allows me particular types of economic power in a context of limited or no alternatives. Now, that's a different conversation to what you might be having in an industrial space. Now, I'm not saying this is generally always true. I mean, I think Nelson Mandela Bay is an example of, instances where it might be that are very particular and unique to that space. However, it becomes quite clear if you look at the killings that we've seen in the hinterland of KZN and in parts of the Eastern Cape, that a big part of why some of the contests at the local government level are fatal has a lot to do with the absence of other alternative livelihood sources that people would draw on. So there's this kind of, a very desperate type of political economy that then emerges. And that political economy, if you think about the division of revenue and how little, for instance, municipal funding of capital infrastructure, so repairing of roads, repairing of, or the building of new settlements and all of that, how much of that money actually comes from money they've raised from property rates and from local industry? I used to always look at the example, OR Tambo municipality. You compare them maybe to another district or maybe to a metro like eThekwini. eThekwini funds a sizable chunk of their capital spending from money they've raised from their industrial base. Not even 20% in a place like OR Tambo is coming from owned revenue, which largely then determines, because remember, capital spend is where the contests are between different, political factions or whatever. That's where the contests are. And those contests, in many ways, I argue, are being drip-fed from, national level, because the path of your conditional grants determines what those contests are going to be fought over. If there's no, municipal infrastructure grant that is going to create subsequent projects that can be fought over because of a cut, because you haven't spent the money properly due to some of the dysfunction we're talking about, then those issues unfold. And I think Xolisi is saying, is the issue of grants not contributing to this failure? Well, it contributes to this failure if your entire operating model is to outsource everything. Because you're creating a parallel political economy that contests over things that you should be providing as a municipality. But because you've become so decapacitated, you don't even know internally, outside of the spec that the same people have helped you draw up, what actually should be happening. Nor are you able to execute on it, because that capacity finds it more viable to sit outside of the state rather than be inside of it.
All right, thanks very much, Aya, for that. Just in terms of, I hinted earlier on that you were going to say a little bit about some of the instruments that we can use to sort of overcome the crisis. If the crisis is historical and structural, where do some of the solutions lie? Where do some of the solutions lie? And perhaps, a related question to that, what would you say to somebody who says, but this, yes, we are seeing quite a rapid collapse of municipal governance in rural areas and in places on the margins, but the urban areas and the metros have also not been spared from the crisis. So what would you say to someone who's sort of grappling with that type of question?
Well, I think I would say to that person before we get to the discussion of the instruments, that in many ways, that's a part of a generalized crisis of capitalism that we're part of. So the local government crisis, be it at a metro, in the urban space, right up to a rural area, can in no way be divorced from the generalized crisis of capitalism that we've been faced with since, I would argue, probably, I guess, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and maybe some might argue 2007-8. But you can't run away from the reality that even the metros have been hard hit by the massive job losses, the massive enterprise destruction that we've seen, which in many ways is linked to the broader structure of the South African economy. When financial and capital markets in North America and in other places experience a severe shock, largely because of our own integration into that global economy, that shock is transmuted here in very particular ways. So I think there's the economic crisis at a fundamental level. Then I think there's also the secondary crisis, well, I wouldn't say a secondary, but a complementary crisis, which is a broader political crisis at the level, yes, of the political parties themselves and the governance institutions and systems. But I would also argue at the level of the society more broadly. Deepening demobilization of the society, atomization of the society, and increasingly a society that is fundamentally being goaded by a very financialized, consumerist, capitalist type of system. And all of these things happen at once. It's not like because we discussed them distinctly, that they happen in a very distinct fashion. No, they are happening all at once at the same time. And I think in many ways, the instruments that we have at our disposal are also about subverting the historic and the contemporary manifestations of this crisis. And I argue, for instance, that the first instrument that we have at our disposal, and I see colleagues have already started to talk about it in the group, is around these grants, the macro fiscal instruments. And we can talk about ring fencing, we can talk about the legal part. I think that's one of many instruments. I think the second instrument that we have is in many ways the natural environment that still remains around us, and the interface between what it is we're producing in the places we come from and what we're spending, the money that is being earned at a household level, earned either through the social wage or the economic wage. And I don't think we've dedicated enough time to that. Let me give just a brief example. In the Eastern Cape alone, and this is data from 2019-20, somewhere there, just over 2.8 billion every month is paid in social grants into the Eastern Cape. Bulk of those grants is the old age grant, around 1,900 or so, or just in that region, north of 1,500 Rand, and then followed, of course, by the child support grant. Now, there is no mechanism that we have at a local government level that says at least a portion, even 15% of that money must go towards value chains that are interested in reinvesting that money in that locale, or in that district, or in that province, or in that spatial corridor in a meaningful way. Because we can't run away from the fact that if a lot of that money is spent on food, our food system is so has such long value chains that are so geographically dispersed from distribution centers, that in many ways, even the repatriation and the reinvestment of that money is highly unlikely if all of that money ends up in a ShopRite in Mkanduli, and yet very little of what's in the distribution centers of ShopRite that gets to the shelves is actually being produced in Mkanduli. So there's also, for me, I think the geographic, or the power in many ways, that comes from how do we think about subverting many of these geographic value chains. And a critical part of that in a province like the Eastern Cape, in Limpopo, and even in KZN, is really training our attention on some of the social grant expenditure. And I argue in the book that one of the tools is, and people don't like to experiment. I was saying when we were starting, for a country that fails a lot, we really, really don't like to experiment. Even our mechanisms and our processes, when it comes to really doing studies that allow you to really think differently about these things, are very, very constraining. But that's a story for another day. But I argue for this cashless component in the existing grant. So if you take the 1,890 old age grant and you say 10% of that will be a cashless pocket, where on the day where you go and collect IPay, which is what people call the social transfers, you'll be able to buy from selected areas where local producers are selling their wares. And you go there with the voucher that you have, and that voucher is scanned. It might have a QR code that's given to you when your card has just been swiped. And the idea is that allows us to say, in this big market that we have of social grant recipients, what are some of the things that if there was an additional intervention or investment, would they want to buy that might be locally produced? So you get that demand signal. But I think the second element to it is to say, we can't, as households, only just be recipients of this, but we must also, where it is possible to do so, participate in production or productive activities that would allow for us to, in many ways, make sure that what we put in our mouths, at least a significant part of that is coming from our own environment. And I think that's critical to resolving the other issues that we have. Because even poorer countries have much lower unemployment than us, because you haven't seen the decimation of peasant agriculture or a subsistence agriculture in the scale that you've seen in South Africa. You haven't had the dislocation of the agrarian transformation of the society in the way that you've seen in South Africa. I mean, even Lesotho has much lower unemployment than we do. And I think a big part of economic participation is around some of these day-to-day primordial needs. I argue in the book that it's not just about food. You know, we have districts who procure ventilated, improved pit toilets every year and act like, you know, we're starting afresh. And that's the other instrument. We have to use procurement as a mechanism that builds long-term relationships. The reason why procurement is so expensive for the state, the reason why you can have the types of fields, I don't know if I should call it a field, what happened out in Lesotho, is largely because every single time anything goes out on tender, it's like a new process of price discovery, a new process of discovering the marketplace. We didn't know who produced toilets, yet we buy them every year. And this is what then opens the space for all of these political economic contests at the level of the party, the local state, and the society. Because it's I hate to use the version that another politician was mentioning today, but it just seems like it's a lottery every time. And no country that has ever industrialized can work haphazardly in that fashion, or work in a fashion where you leave so many things to chance. Let me pause there. So I think those are the three instruments: procurement, our social grants, and of course, effectively the hands that we have, and the large pieces of land that can be put to productive use if some stimulus of having the government as the buyer of last resort can effectively be put in place.
All right, we've got more questions. We've got more questions and comments in the chat box.
Yeah, I saw one that's saying employment is wage slavery.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's one that says, I understand the failure of local governance is systemic across South Africa, but is there perhaps just one example within South Africa of one local government area in the rural areas which provides hope or provides a model to mimic?
Yo.
So that's one about hope. Yeah, whilst you're still thinking about that, I mean, in the book, you talk about three things, and you've touched on two, right? There's the secure the base, and you're talking about how to use social grants to reinvest in local economies and to bolster small producers. The second one is secure the home and how we can use procurement to support local industrialization. And you've spoken a little bit about that. In the book, you also talk about securing the future.
Yeah. Let me talk about that briefly.
If you can just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think let me talk about that briefly, just to maybe also answer Zahira's question, and I think maybe get to Kathy's question around employment. Look, I think the securing the home part is the one I find the most fascinating. Just the build, supplies, value chain is something I find quite mind-blowing. The one reason for that is because you've got an entire value chain in the building of homes in the countryside, and there's beautiful homes that people have built in the last while. But I don't know who shared the Tuscan design with whomever, because I remember driving in Lady Frere 2 weeks ago and saying to my sister, count for me how many houses are here that are built with burnt brick and zinc roofs. And it was probably, just in a quick snapstick poll, probably 7 out of the 10 that we passed during that moment. And the question I was asking myself was, that's probably for functionality the worst thing you'd want, because of the severe temperature and the severe, I guess, weather in that part of the world. When it's hot, it's really hot. When it's cold in winter, it's really, really cold. And potentially you would probably want to make the best use of a combination, yes, of modernist approaches to architecture and to the building of it, but also local materials, because one of the reasons why people built rondavels, and this is not to lock people into one particular aesthetic mode of production, was also because you could locally find within a particular radius much of the materials you would need to build that. And we've created now, in our rapid residential advance in many of the rural areas, a dislocation between how we build our homes and, of course, how the proximity of the materials that we use. And that's why when you go to rural areas now, you are going to find many hardware stores close to the high streets that go into different parts of the rural areas to exploit that opportunity. but we're not using our forests and many of the other things that we have at our disposal to make best use of that value chain. So that's what I mean, and even with the example around the toilets I was making earlier on. On securing the future, I think it's critical in the energy and the digital transition that we're part of at the moment, which in many ways are going to be, alongside a demographic transition, in my view, critical social processes over the next while. We need to find a way to corner that. I mean, it's concerning. We saw it now in the higher education sector. You know, the experiences, and you know, university was always seen as an equalizer, right? All of us are in the same residences, irrespective of where we come from. But now, you know, remote learning means that I must go back to Kukwala and deal with edge, you know, type of internet, while trying to make the best use of my educational or pedagogic experience, and try and be able to perform at the level that a Kevin, who might be, you know, close to a Vodacom tower or a tower of whatever ISP provider, you know, might not necessarily have. And I think for me, that's a major issue. And we're starting to see, I mean, you know, we're involved in one project out in the Eastern Cape trying to, you know, set up Wi-Fi hotspots in townships and, you know, in areas of high footfall in many of the peri-urban settlements. And the biggest difficulty, you can deploy everything you want. The biggest difficulty is the back-end infrastructure, some of which is, you know, owned by some of our SOEs. I mean, I think about Telkom, Broadband, Infraco, you know. So there's all of these issues that, you know, make it very difficult even to make that advance. I think the second one is around renewable energy. And how do we contest this space and move away from this community trustization? Community trusts are critical, they're important, to make sure that there's a collective instrument that people can use to benefit from the investments that are around them. But we need to advance that and say, who is repairing the wind propellers that are in a wind energy farm not too far from, you know, the former Sky, that is part of the renewables program? And what are the obligations that we're using in the broader structural procurement program to lock in some of those obligations around repair, maintenance, and even an evolution to higher value chain elements of that? So we don't only want to be the guys that are just smashing the metal, but we also want to be the guys that are designing the generation and the transmission elements of that solution, and even some of the downstream possibilities. I mean, simple things like, do we know where many of the prepaid meters that are put into our homes are manufactured? I don't know. I know, like in the home I live in, I don't know. So there's all of these questions that I think are scope and possibilities for localization. And I do think, to Zahira's question, that there have been examples. There certainly have been examples where there've been, you know, projects. But for me, the issue is not about, I mean, it's, in many ways, it's a team effort, largely because of how fickle these municipal boundaries are, and the cross-border economic implications of how economic activity is set up. So you might be producing in Inokum Kichima, but if your main market requires you to go through Mhlonto municipality and the roads are horrible there, that has a massive implication industrially on what it is that you're trying to do. You might have grown up in a particular boundary, but have to live much of your life in another boundary or traverse the two. And I think this culture of, you know, it's also driven, I guess, by how we audit people, but this culture of thinking that it's just my municipality and just my own space, I think is very unhelpful. I think the question on employment being wage slavery, one of the opportunities, of course, that arise with thinking of employment not just as something that is about getting a wage, but meeting needs and livelihoods rather than just, you know, industrial wages, is that you begin to realize that in many ways, the employment relationship is about a contestation of economic and political power, which is the same with everything in the society. And I think one of the critical things that we need, even in a transitional program towards socialism in South Africa, is to not run away from understanding employment in very different ways to what it might have been presented as historically. And I think the big issue around that is also about the contestations around power. So what is a job? And a job is something that requires you in many cases to leave your home. What does it mean to subvert that relation and think even about care as something that can be a job? not in terms of the wage employer relation, but also in terms of saying it's something that can contribute to me being able to socially reproduce myself, the people that are close to me, and all of the people that I have effective bonds with. So I think for me, this issue of saying, think differently about employment as we strive towards full employment, and is for me a critical part of any transitional and liberatory project. Because I mean, I don't see anybody being convinced by you coming to them and saying, you know, employment is wage slavery, and therefore, you know, unless you're coming with a very, very other compelling alternative.
All right. Thanks for that. I'm going to invite you to just give us your concluding remarks, really. And maybe as you do that, there are a number of things being proposed in the chat. I mean, the first one really is this question that has been raised by a number of comrades. How do we bridge the urban and rural binary, especially when the urban is almost exclusively for consumption and the rural for production? That's Kenneth Matlawe asking that question. I don't know if we will have time to take that, because I'm aware that you have to go quite soon. But then there's also this suggestion about a discussion of sorts about the book and getting to know quite intimately the arguments in the book. So it's a challenge to us as Chisimani, and we will try and make that happen, Comrade Kenneth. With your concluding remarks, I'm just wondering if you can touch on this question of timidity when it comes to imagination or imagining alternatives. You spoke earlier about how we tend not to be willing to take risks in certain areas, especially areas that involve possibilities and imagination. So maybe just touch on that a little bit, but also what constrains the imagination? I mean, other people might say that the experiences of the last 2 decades and more of rampant corruption, of greed and abuse of public resources and all of that has led many people to become quite suspicious of the state, or even the idea of anything public, or that anything that is publicly driven. So there's that big challenge that we face at the moment. And I'm just wondering, with your concluding remarks, maybe you can just touch on that and leave us with some nuggets to think about.
Yeah, look, I think the state has to be an important actor. It has to be at the center of the distributional contest in the society. Very few of us vote for, you know, boards of directors in firms who make decisions over what we eat and what we don't eat. And so in many ways, I think a big part of contesting the space for power with where we are with capitalism is about taking the task of building and capacitating the state very, very seriously. And I mean, I think Zahira's question around where some of the good examples are, I think it's something we're going to have to return to. Because
Are you still there?
oh, can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yeah?
Oh, sorry about that. No, I was saying, I think if we're really interested in building a capable state, and a state that doesn't approach these questions with timidity, but that approaches these questions, because these are questions of equity, these are questions of how resources and the wealth of the society is distributed. These are questions that, you know, I mean, there's a difficult question of how and under what conditions do people who survive in a context where the economy can accumulate without the need for their warm bodies. It's something I raise in the book, to say capitalism is changing in very particular ways that are going to make it difficult in future to achieve this objective of what we think decent work might be. And in that context, you need the state to come in and create the distributional equity in the society that ensures that people are able to live above what is a socially agreed on level, from a societal level, morally, ethically. So I think that's the first. I think then the second one is, you know, in many ways, there's the difficult issues around migration that some of the questions in the chat have raised. And also, you know, some of the big challenges that arise for me in the book that are institutional, but that are also economic. And I think a starting point to the point you were raising of rural areas just being areas of consumption rather than areas of production is something that emerges from the intentional design of apartheid. And we haven't taken this post-colonial reality seriously of trying to subvert that relation. And, you know, it was gutting to go, for instance, during the July unrest to a place called Isitebe in Mandeni, which used to be part of the former decentralization areas in the former KwaZulu homeland. And there's some manufacturing of textiles that's happening there. And of course, other, you know, things that are being manufactured in that part of the world as well. And what for me is concerning was we haven't been able, even with those ghosts of Bantustan, to say, well, you know, fine, the idea and the ethos behind it might have been wrong, but we also believe in how critical industrialization is going to be. It's critical for us to produce. It's critical for us to not only just be people who are happy with having nearly a fifth of your economy or a fifth of your consumption coming from imports, when you can effectively contest that in areas of economic activity where you can replace some of those imports. And I make a few examples in the book. I mean, I argue that with the massive advantage that South Africa has in dairy production, it is scandalous that a big part of even, you know, the powdered milk consumption needs of South Africa and the continent is coming from outside of the continent. It is scandalous that the things that we need to house, clothe, and do all of these things for ourselves, least of all now with COVID, where it's not just about the efficiency of value chains, but it's also about the resilience of being able to meet certain needs that in some cases are life or death. We have to return to this idea of we can also be producers, but we're also fighting against another countervailing social force, which is the very alluring idea of consumerism. And you see it on the weekends, you saw it in the visuals that had come out of Gonka. And I think for me, that ideational battle is a much, much bigger battle, because you can't deal with imports if our proclivity is for imported brands and all of the things that are conspicuous signals of status. And so there's a psychological contest and fight that needs to happen alongside the economic struggle, because some of the proceeds of the corruption we were talking about end up in the bank accounts of car dealerships, rather than in experimentation of the type that reinvests our time, our energy, and our know-how in solving social problems. So somebody would be willing to go and steal R1 million coming through from the same department that wouldn't even give a young entrepreneur in that space 90,000, you know, to experiment with a particular type of idea. And I think for me, that isn't something that I can rationally explain politically and economically, but is also a massive crisis of mindset that any liberatory project or political program is going to have to address in a very, very meaningful way. So let me pause there and once again thank Chisimani and My Vote Counts, and all of the comrades who've been able to join us today, you know, for giving me the space to maybe share some of my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Aya. That brings us to the end of this chat. We will be back again on the 14th of October. And on the 14th, we are discussing what do the elections present. So it's the local government crisis again, but what can we hope for out of these elections? Thank you very much, Aya, for making the time, and thank you to everyone who came through to join us for this webinar. I know some of you are watching in groups and all of that. Thank you so much for all your questions and your comments. Please do look out for our social media pages, My Vote Counts and Chisimani Center for Activist Education, for any announcements on these issues. Every Monday, we've got a series of material that we release under our program called Municipal Mondays. So please follow us on our social media pages, and see you again on the 14th of October. Thank you very much. Bye.